Irma Faye Stewart, a 30-year-old single African-American mother of two who was arrested as part of a drug sweep in Hearne, Texas. All but one of the people arrested were African-American. You are innocent. After a week in jail, you have no one to care for your two small children, and you are eager to get home. Your court-appointed attorney urges you to plead guilty to the drug distribution charges, saying the prosecutor has offered probation. You refuse, steadfastly proclaiming your innocence. And so, after almost a month in jail, you decide to plead guilty to the charges so that you can return home to your children. Unwilling to risk a trial and years of imprisonment, you are sentenced to 10 years probation in order to pay $1,000 in fines, as well as court and probation costs. In addition, you are labeled a drug felon. You are no longer eligible for food stamps. You may be discriminated against in employment. You are about to be evicted from public housing, and you cannot vote for at least 12 years. And once homeless, your children will be taken away from you and put into foster care. This is mass incarceration, a system where our nation's police departments, judicial system, and media target poor Black communities with the purpose of incarcerating them. The Bureau of Justice reports that 38% of the incarcerated population are Black Americans, despite Black Americans only representing 13% of all U.S. residents. On the other hand, white Americans make up 35% of the incarcerated population, yet 62% of all U.S. residents. Now, while these injustices are mainly caused by our criminal justice system, there's also an equally important clause, and that is you. It's him, it's her, it's me, it's anyone who is not a Black person living below the poverty line in America and therefore is not targeted by this system. Now, more specifically, it's our implicit bias that perpetuates mass incarceration. Implicit bias is essentially a shortcut for our brains, where we take information that we've seen or that we've heard and we apply it to different circumstances. Now I'm gonna ask you all to get comfortable. Roll your shoulders, stretch your back, take a deep breath in and out. Now I'm gonna ask you to envision a criminal. Who did you see? If you saw a Black man, I wouldn't be too surprised because this is what we see every day in movies, TV shows, and in the news, Black men being depicted as criminals. In fact, news reports tend to use harsher headlines for stories about a Black man as opposed to the more sympathetic headlines for stories about white people. In 2018, Pacific Standard reported that in looking at mass shooters, the odds that a white shooter will receive the mental illness frame is 19 times greater than the odds of a Black shooter. So we constantly see Black people being portrayed as criminals, and we start to believe it. And our police officers, our judges, aren't exempt from these biases either. In fact, in a simulation where police officers were asked to quickly identify and shoot armed suspects as opposed to unarmed suspects, researchers found that a group of Denver-based police officers more quickly shot at Black armed suspects than white armed suspects. And in 2010, the implicit association test was given to judges and found that a majority of white judges and a minority of Black judges exhibited bias, favoring whites over African Americans. African Americans are much more disadvantaged when it comes to arrest and sentencing due to the implicit bias of police officers and judges. We see this in the way that police officers use pretext stops and stop and frisk searches. These are essentially random searches of people who look suspicious. And 9 times out of 10, that is a black man. Pretext stops is stopping someone based on a traffic violation. However, the actual intent is to search their cars for drugs. Because of this, African Americans are much more likely to be searched after a stop than white Americans. But it's actually found that they are less likely to have drugs, guns, or alcohol during these discretionary searches. With stop and frisk searches, police officers can essentially stop anyone they like, even on the basis of race. They can deny that they stop people on the basis of race as well. They can say that they stopped someone because their hair wasn't dreads or they were sagging their pants. However, what this colorblind society fails to see is that we associate these traits with black men. And because of that, they're villainized. So let's say that a black man is caught with a possession of drugs. They either go to trial or plead guilty to the charges. Due to the unreasonably long mandatory minimum sentences placed on certain crimes, the time it takes for a case to go to trial, in which you wait in jail, and overworked public defenders who urge their clients to plead guilty, many people choose a plea bargain. But as we see in the case of Irma Faye Stewart, what these people aren't told is that they lose their rights to serve on a jury. They lose their rights to vote. They lose their rights to student loans, public housing, and many other governmental aids as a felon. In addition, they are put on parole, where they can be sent to prison with more than 2 violations of their parole requirements. For example, not meeting with their parole officer despite their driver's license being suspended once labeled a felon. So let's say that this person does want to go to trial. Sentences imposed on black men are 20% longer than those imposed on white men. So they are more likely to be convicted guilty, and after they serve their time in prison, they get out, they're labeled a drug felon, they are put on parole, and they will likely be reincarcerated, either from a parole violation or the same stop and frisk searches or pretext stops that got them there in the first place. Now, do you guys know that prison systems use the literacy rates of 3rd graders to predict how many prison beds they need? I ask you this because when you leave here, I don't want you to just think about the system of mass incarceration. I want you to think about all of the other systems that set up poor black communities for failure. I want you to think about how we perceive prisoners in America, why we see them as inhumane or subhuman. Like, if we were to be in their shoes, if we were to suffer their same pain or their same abuse, that we wouldn't commit the exact same crimes as them. I'd like you to think about why we can't imagine a world without prisons. And what actually is the purpose of prisons anyway? Is it to keep Americans safe, or is it to incarcerate black men for low-level crimes in order to profit from prison labor? Finally, I don't ask you, but I challenge you to be more open, to think about experiences different than yours. I challenge you to notice your own implicit bias and how it dictates some of your actions. And finally, I challenge you to share this TEDx. Share what you've learned so that maybe one day we can decriminalize the image of black men in America. Thank you.